motionless body laid there as if a tide had lightly washed her to shore, halfway between the road and the grass that led to the series of railroad tracks nearby. Her petite frame was blanketed by a small jacket. We sat there in the middle of a cold night, not knowing what to do next. The longer he remained out there, I grew more curious and tried looking out of the window to see what was happening. What happened to her? Was it a murder? Suicide? Whose child was she? These questions have gone unanswered since I have been hesitant to revisit that memory or approach my father about the subject. It made me wonder what it feels like for a mother to lose her child so early. Sometimes it seems like it's all in the plan. Whether occurrences such as this are part of God's plan or the work of some other entity has been debated forever. I'm not here to make that judgment. What I will point out is how unfair it is to be exposed to the worst of the world and expected to turn around simply based on the will or lack thereof to do so. I remember this specific night because I was afraid to ask my dad for a long time what actually happened. But I recently had a conversation with my mom because she read this book. She asked me, she said, "How did you even remember that?" I said, "There was a vivid moment in my life because I remember seeing the woman on the side of the road, and she asked me if I actually knew what happened, and I told her I didn't. Well, I recently found out that woman was murdered, and I remembered how I felt in that moment and how it felt for me actually to find out that's exactly what happened. And there are so many moments when I was a kid, I was exposed to different elements of what it meant to live in a community like where I grew up. So eventually I got to a place in my life, I started to question a whole lot. And because I had dealt with so much trauma and dealt with so many other different things in my life, I didn't feel like I could ever be at a place where somebody would understand that experience. And for a long time, I didn't feel that anybody could actually love me. Not necessarily my family specifically, but just a partner or anybody for that matter. So I struggled quite a bit throughout my life and actually trying to face that. And then this beautiful woman came along and she showed me otherwise. And throughout the history of my life, I think I've gained so much more perspective about love and what it means to actually love yourself. But I grew up in a place where the expectations on me were a little bit different. I always felt like I had to be perfect. I felt like I couldn't fail anybody. And so as I got older, I would hate to fail in front of anybody. So I hid myself a lot. I wore this armor, and there are so many wounds under this armor. There's so many areas where I had gone unhealed, and I really didn't know how to grapple with that. So I think eventually, just to kind of move forward in the story a little bit, when I finally got up to the age where I was actually doing more with my life, people noticed like all the things that I had going on. And so the expectation just kept rising because I kept showing up and actually kept up with the expectations, not only of other people, but for what I had for myself. And I remember a specific time when I actually got to a place where I faced a challenge and I didn't really know how to navigate it. I tore my ACL probably 6 years ago, actually a little bit over 6 years ago in 2017. And going through that experience was pretty unique because I had never been in a place where I really couldn't do for myself. I had always done that. So when I tore my ACL, that challenged me in a completely unique way because my surgery didn't go perfect. And I remember I woke up one morning in a level of pain that I had never experienced before. And I thought back to a quote that I remember from Derrick Rose, and to sum it up, he talked about when he tore his ACL, it felt like death. And I remember that moment when I tried to stand up it felt like somebody was pulling my leg apart. So I hopped back on the floor and I had to navigate to the bathroom to brush my teeth. So I just got on my bottom and I scooted towards the bathroom. And I remember when I finally got in the bathroom, I had to figure out how to get up to get my toothbrush. So I grabbed onto the sink, grabbed my toothbrush, grabbed the toothpaste, and I began to brush my teeth. And I remember thinking to myself, the rest of the world is moving forward regardless of what's going on in my life. Like, I'm in this amount of pain, but nobody can feel this with me. Nobody can understand what I'm going through, because it wasn't just the physical pain. It was what I was going through psychologically as well. Because I realized that there are so many of those unhealed wounds at that point that I hadn't necessarily grappled with, that now I really had to face. And so I had to find out another way to actually cope with that. So I got to a point where I'm just sitting at home by myself and trying to figure out, like, what can I do to actually work my way through this pain psychologically. So I bought like a game system, which I passively began to play over the course of time. But then the rest of that year, I had gotten pretty good throughout my life as far as being able to show up in moments that I needed to show up, and being able to go through certain processes that I had to get through as long as there was a plan for me. So I got pretty good at those next big projects that I was working on. I had a history of creating viral videos with a friend of mine, Sebastian Carson. And when it came time to actually create a new project, I was on it all the time. And throughout the rest of that year, I had this big plan to create this video that eventually went viral, and that eventually led to a Facebook reality show, which was actually pretty fun for me to do, because I got an opportunity to sit in a very similar situation to this, behind a camera, or in front of a camera, I should say. And all those moments were the foundation that I had been laying for years. And when it came down to it, I still had those expectations on myself of how all of this was going to play out like magic. Every time I needed to show up, I was able to do it. But I got back to a place where after I tore my ACL, I tweaked my knee again. And then I developed like plantar fasciitis, and something happened in my shoulder. And there were all these other injuries that I eventually had to deal with and learn to live with. So it felt like every time I started to move forward physically, something else would happen. And then that manifested in other areas of my life. I remember when my younger brother, Marquis, lost his leg. And I thought to myself, this is the first little brother I ever had, a year and a half younger than me. And I remembered the pain that I felt when it felt like somebody was pulling my knee apart. And I thought to myself, with him losing his leg, the kind of impact that was going to have on him. And I got worried. And then I got a call from my brother, who's a year and a half older than me. He was dealing with some stuff from a mental health standpoint that he just needed help with. And he wanted me to figure out how I could guide him, because he always called me his little big brother. And that was just our relationship. And so when they needed help, I tried to show up in the best way that I possibly could. When my family needed help, I always tried to show up, because that was part of the responsibility that I had, especially from the men in my family. We all just had a different relationship. So eventually, as I'm navigating all of this, still dealing with all my personal stuff, COVID hits. And for me, I was always outside, always working on something, always moving, always going. So COVID felt like prison for me. It felt like I couldn't figure out what to do next in this situation. And I remember as I sat there, I went back to figuring out how I could cope again. Because I had literally just gotten over me tearing my ACL and the pain that was associated with that. So to be back there again, I went back to the same coping mechanism, because at that point I wasn't in therapy. I wasn't doing some of the other ways that I could have used to cope, because I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what it meant to be transparent and vulnerable with somebody and share those experiences with an objective person. So I connected with friends as much as I possibly could because, again, COVID, the only thing I knew was to connect with people. So hopping on Call of Duty every day was part of that process for me, part of that coping mechanism that I eventually developed. And that slowed me down in other areas of my life. It took me to a place where, like, this perfect guy was no longer perfect. So I sat there many days going through that and trying to cope with that level of stress and anxiety that I was dealing with all of those things that were going on with my brothers and the rest of my family. And so it got to a point where we just decided to go back to Memphis for a bit. It was never the plan to be there forever. So, it just kind of worked out where I was able to do the same job that I was doing before back in Memphis. And when I went back, I had no idea what was going to happen as a result of all of that. But that's when life really turned left for me. And I write in this book, it felt like dying. Dying seemed like the easier choice. I never harmed myself. I never had plans to. I just did not see how I could move forward. It felt like I went back home just for my life to fall apart. I remember when I actually had this thought, where I was from a mental standpoint. I was sitting in a car at a red light, and I thought back to that moment when I saw that woman on the side of the road, and I thought about how her family possibly felt when they found out that she was on the side of some railroad tracks. At that point, obviously, I didn't know that she had gotten murdered, but I knew she was dead. So I thought back to that moment when I was sitting at a red light, and I told myself that I had dealt with so much at that point that it didn't really matter what happened to me because nobody really cared. I had moments like that where I'm fighting so much from an internal standpoint. I just didn't know how I could move forward. I remember having that feeling as I sat at that light and I told myself it didn't really matter what happened to me. I was dealing with a level of chronic stress that I had never experienced. I was dealing with a level of anxiety that I had never experienced because I thought it was bad when I tore my ACL. But when I got to that point, everything was different. So I told myself it might be easier if I wasn't here. It might be easier for me. It might be easier for everybody else. I didn't have any intention to take my life or anything like that, but I wasn't going to resist if something were to happen. And that was a tough place for me to be because I had gotten to a place where I felt like I needed to be Superman and save everybody. And because I thought to myself at that point, I had failed so many people that it didn't really matter if I was here or not. Because for so long, I told myself that if I was there with my family, things would be a whole lot easier for me. And just to give you a little bit of background on what kind of led to that situation when I'm sitting at that traffic light, in June of 2021, I had two of the toughest conversations I've ever had in my life. Part of that was when I lost my best friend. And the second part of that, I received a phone call from my mom, and she told me something had happened within our family that I had grown afraid of and that I was trying to prevent. So I used to have these Zoom calls during COVID with my brothers and some of the men within my family to try to get us to a place where we were all moving forward in life. And as I mentioned, I was helping my brother sort of navigate some mental health circumstances. And my mom calls me and she shares with me that something had happened. And I tried to keep my composure for her. But internally, I was going through something that I just didn't even understand. And I remember when I hung up the phone, how dark it was, because I knew at that moment my family was about to change forever. Following that, in July of 2021, I almost lost somebody who was extremely important to me. And then I lost an aunt. At the end of that month, I remember going to my parents' house, and I promised myself that I would be around for my family more. And part of that promise was actually showing up and being around my brothers and sisters as much as I possibly could, because I knew I wouldn't be in Memphis forever. And I remember my 25-year-old brother, as he was going through the pain that he experienced. He had several accidents, and he was dealing with some other circumstances because he lost his son 5 years prior in 2016. And one of the challenges that he faced was his body was deteriorating, and we could see it as it was happening. And so I was pretty intentional in having a conversation with him on that specific day. So I looked for him and I couldn't find him. And so when I finally did find him, he was sitting on the porch, sort of slumped over because his body was just like breaking down. And I made him a promise. I said, once I finish taking care of this, we're going to get you some help. What sucked for me is maybe not even a week later, we're on the phone call with my older brother, who at this point was the reason why I'm running around like a chicken with his head cut off, because he ended up getting locked up. And the promise that I made to my younger brother was something that I very much intended to keep. So we're all on the phone call together, and my younger brother's excited because his birthday's coming up. And we're all talking about that and what he plans to do. And so we hang that phone call up. I didn't know what was going to happen a couple of days later, because on August 3rd of 2021, I got a phone call from my older brother, Bakari, and what he said made my heart drop. He said, "Fat is gone." So I paused, he paused, and he said it again. He said, "Fat is gone, bro." And for me to say it out loud was something that I couldn't really comprehend, because that made it real. And I remember as I was sitting there on that Tuesday afternoon, the only thing I could do was like run to the backyard and just like pace back and forward, because I kept repeating it to myself. Fat is gone. Fat is gone. Fat is gone. That's what we call my brother Takari growing up, because when he was born, he was this big baby. He was hefty. So we called him Fat or Potato Man. He had a bunch of different nicknames, but primarily we called him Fat. So I remember going over to my parents' house and seeing the scene there, and like all these people showed up and seeing all of these faces. But the tough part was my younger brother passed in the room that I grew up in. So I remembered also that in that same room, I used to do like push-ups a lot when we were kids. And Fat walked into the room one day and he saw me doing those push-ups. He looked up at me, he said, when I finally finished, he looked up at me and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." And I never forgot that, because to me, my little brother did look at me like Superman. And so I tried to keep up with that as much as I possibly could. And that was the same thing that continued to happen throughout my life. I wanted to be that not only for my younger brother, but for the rest of my family as well. So as I grappled with the fact that I lost my little brother on August 3rd of 2021 and had all of these other things going on with my life, I knew things were going to be different, but I didn't know how different they were going to be. One of the things that I did throughout my life was I told myself that all the stuff that I saw in my community, as far as like the people that I saw who use alcohol and all of these other things to cope. I told myself that I wouldn't do that. And so when it got to a point where I'm dealing with this chronic stress and dealing with anxiety and dealing with this level of depression that I found myself dealing with and not even understanding it, I'd go out and, you know what, let me just grab a drink. Not having really any intention behind it. But as I started to deal with all of these things, one on top of another, didn't really have the time to grieve that I felt like I needed. And I found myself going out socially a little bit more and consuming alcohol a little bit more. Never to the point where I felt like, in my mind, I was an alcoholic or anything of that nature. But it was a little bit too much for me because I had pledged that I wouldn't do that. But then, fast forward a couple months later, I get a phone call from my cousin, and he tells me that my uncle has cancer. And this is a cousin who is like one of my closest friends. I didn't know he was grappling with that. And I remembered feeling a level of uncertainty as I was about to go visit my uncle who I hadn't seen in a very long time. And the reason why this uncle was so important to me was when I graduated college, he was the one uncle out of all the uncles that I have that actually showed up for me. And he reminded me of my dad, but he was my dad, except he was a little bit meaner. And he was always the uncle that I looked at as the strong uncle, because that's what I wanted to be for my nieces and nephews. So when I actually got a chance to see him, it hurt me in a different kind of way as I'm grappling with all of these other things, because this strong uncle who I remembered strong as an ox worked 12 to 15, 16, 17-hour days at a time throughout my life, seeing him not being able to do things for himself and him not being able to lift himself up in the bed and not being able to hold water for him to drink it. The pain that I felt, it was all coming back. The stress that I felt, it was all coming back again. And I remember not being able to make it to his funeral because we had plans to go out of the country. And I remember the pain that I felt not being able to do that. And you'd think that was the end of it. At least you'd hope that was the end of all of it. But as I'm trying to navigate all these things, trying to be Superman for everybody, I made a promise to myself that what had happened in August, I wouldn't allow it to happen again because I needed to be aware of what was happening with my family. So fast forward, February 2022 rolls around, and it had gotten to a point where every time my phone rang, I was anxious. I was stressed because I felt like it was something else that was happening. And I told myself that I can't fail anybody else anymore. It's time for me to show up the way that I know I can and be that Superman that I always felt like I could be for my family. I was operating in survival mode. I used to have constant headaches, and I described it as if I went into this dark room. In this dark room, it smelled horrible, but because of what was in there, I had to go into that room to pull things out, to save the people who were also in that room. But I didn't realize, as a result of going into that room, when you go into a place that smells, after a while, you get accustomed to the smell. So no matter what you do following that smell sticks to you. So during this process, I become inconsolable. My attitude changes, and I'm not operating as the optimal version of myself. And that impacted my relationships because I'm going through so much pain, grappling with so much, but I still have to show up. So 2 months into 2022, I get that phone call from my dad, and he tells me that my younger sister and my niece have been in an accident. I had just seen my niece 2 days earlier, and she has this thing where she tricks all of us with it. It's kind of her thing. Hey, my favorite uncle. And she has this big smile on her face constantly. So I had just seen that a couple days earlier. And my dad tells me that she's in this accident. He sent pictures of the car. Car is completely totaled. I don't know what's about to happen. Is my niece going to survive? Is my sister going to survive? I found out that my niece had a fractured skull, 3 years old, fractured her skull. Her eye is out of socket, and we are not sure if she's going to make it. So a couple of days passed by, and I finally get a FaceTime call from my little sister, and she's scratched up. And I look over and I see my niece, and I try to be positive. Hey, Armani. Hey, Armani. And I'm trying to be excited for her. But that smile I just seen a couple of days earlier was gone. She couldn't even respond. Her brain wasn't functioning. She couldn't walk. She couldn't talk. The only thing she could do was just turn her head and look back at the camera. And I remembered again, it was like I had failed another person. So for me, going through that process and seeing what my sister had to go through, driving from city to city, from Tennessee to Georgia, to get my niece the care that she needed, it was painful to watch. And watching my 3-year-old niece learning to walk and talk again after she had just learned this recently was painful as she's navigating this situation and watching the pain that my little sister feels as she tries to make sure that her baby is okay. Well, we didn't know a couple weeks later that I began another phone call, sitting in the exact same spot that I was 7 months earlier. My little brother, Marquis, the first little brother that I ever had. I get a phone call from my brother, Bakari. And the only thing he tells me was, come to the house. Didn't say anything other than that, but I knew when he said it, there was something going on. So he said, come to the house. And when I get there, it's the exact same scene as it was 7 months ago. Everybody has shown up to come together during this moment, this very important moment for my family. But as I'm arriving, the ambulance is pulling away. And there was something in me that knew that my brother wasn't going to make it. So I knew I had a choice. Go to the hospital or not. Those were the only two options that I had. And part of that process, I had to actually share with people that my younger brother was on his way to the hospital and probably wasn't going to make it. And making several of those phone calls, I called my dad and shared it with him. And, he was on his way from church. And my dad has always been sort of a spiritual guide for me, really just the roadmap for everything I've done in my life. And I remembered 7 months earlier that he had just delivered a eulogy for my 25-year-old brother. And he was probably going to have to do it again for my 30-year-old brother. But the reason this one was so unique is this is the first little brother that I ever had. So we used to share the same picture with each other to tell each other happy birthday every April and every September. Well, this was March. And as I'm contemplating whether I should go to the hospital or not, I thought to myself, I'm not going to get that birthday wish this year. So I decide I'm going to go to the hospital, and I arrive and my 3 sisters are there, Danielle, Tierney, and Tia. And as wild as it is to say, my sister Tierney was just a couple of blocks up because that's the hospital where my niece was after her accident. And we're all sitting in the waiting room as we're getting ready to go see my little brother, who we know is not going to make it. We finally go into the room, and I sit there and talk to him for a bit. And we always talked about who was better at football. We used to joke with each other a lot about that. And one of the last things I said to him was that you're still not better than me at football. But In saying that, there was a lot of pain because I put my hand on his chest and I didn't feel anything. Everything felt empty. There was no heartbeat. And losing him, losing my brother, my other brother, my uncle, my aunt, my best friend, all so quickly, my heartbeat was gone too. And just to deal with that level of pain so quickly, I literally didn't know what I was gonna do. So when I thought to myself, it doesn't matter what happens to me, there's no way for me to move forward. I failed everybody. This image of perfection that I think so many people add of me throughout the history of my life, I felt like it was all gone now. It all fallen apart. I had worn this armor throughout my life. And one thing after another happened. There was like so many different chinks eventually that showed up in this armor. And it was like people could actually see that there was pain under it. All those wounds, all that pain that I had never grappled with. It was all there. And I felt like I had to tell the story. I had to become more transparent, more vulnerable, because otherwise I probably wasn't gonna make it. Not because I was gonna do something to myself, but because of the level of stress that I was dealing with. My heart was beating differently. The things that were happening in my head, all of it was different. My entire life was different. So trying to be that perfect person, trying to be Superman, for me and for everybody else, it didn't actually serve anybody. So it was extremely difficult as I went through all of that, as my family went through all of that. But because for me, I felt like I had failed so many people. And this pattern that had eventually created where it was like every single month or two, something else was happening. I realized that in my entire life had to change. I had to make an adjustment to the point where if I was going to be here, I had to learn how to live with all of these things. I had to be more resilient in ways that I hadn't before. I had to be more transparent, more vulnerable in ways that I hadn't had before. I hadn't been before. So my entire life looked different following all of that. And so what that meant is, as I was going through this experience, my brother Marquis, I was teaching him how to trade crypto. Well, the thing about our relationship was when you juxtapose those next to each other, since he was a year and a half younger than me, my first little brother, everything I did, he did it, but he did it in his own way. He was super rebellious in that way. So if I sold cars like I did retail, he sold them wholesale. If I did push-ups growing up, he did calf raises growing up every night. So it got to a point we were finally kind of doing the same thing because he wanted to learn how to trade and I was teaching him how to trade crypto, but instead he wanted to trade gold. So it was like that relationship that we had with each other. So for a while, I couldn't do any trading. One of the last things he asked me to do was to actually work out with me. And I never got a chance to work out with him, and I felt really bad about that. So eventually, after all of these things happened, I got to a place where I said, okay, well, now I need to learn to live this new life. I'm by myself now. So what can I do? So I started looking at charts again and trading again. I got back into the gym. I go create a website and built an app. And eventually I wrote an ebook. Then I wrote another book because I had to learn that despite all of this, everybody has a story. Everybody's story is unique. It may not sound exactly like this one, but everybody has a story. And as you go through experiences, one of the things you have to challenge yourself to do is to continue to show up despite what's happening for you. That's what I did when I tore my ACL. That's what I did each time when I lost another family member. That resilience that I developed over a certain amount of times of going through all of these experiences, that's what I kept having to do. And so this was just such a unique situation for me because all of it just happened so quickly that I never really had a time to adjust. So I started to meditate again. So my meditations went from 15 minutes to an hour because I told myself I would rather be operating in that world than to be in this one where I'm dealing with this chronic stress every day. I started going to the gym and going harder in the gym and challenging myself in new ways and doing push-ups every day, just like I used to as a kid. And I remember telling myself that nobody ever asked me to be Superman. Nobody ever asked that. But that's what I wanted to give everybody that I love, because what was important to me was that I showed up for everybody else despite what was going on for me, what was happening for me. So dealing with all of this, I said to myself that I forgot how to love myself. And despite being resilient, despite showing up for other people, despite that being what I knew, I finally had to show up for myself. And so again, everybody has a story. Your story might not sound exactly like this one, but no matter what happens in your life, no matter how tough it gets, the one thing you have to remember is it's going to hurt, but it won't kill you.